So I guess we can go ahead and jump into our conversation about the Fourth Crusade.
Yes.
So, Dr. Schrader, actually, the stuff we were just saying was kind of interesting. You were kind of talking about the complexity of the Fourth Crusade and how there's a lot of back politics to it that you think is really critical to understanding the Fourth Crusade, and how that contributes to a lot of the misunderstandings around the Fourth Crusade. Because frequently, when you see sort of popular culture comments on the Fourth Crusade, it is kind of just like, oh man, this is just proof of how bad the Crusades were, and obviously it was all hypocritical because here they are attacking Constantinople, so that kind of thing. So did you want to talk a little bit about that? I just kind of thought that was interesting what you were saying just now.
It's, as I said, when I was sort of preparing for this, I realized, and I've tried to go back and look at some of the early history, I realized just how very, very complex the relationship had been. And I expect we've talked about this in other podcasts of yours about the First Crusade and the issues that the Crusaders felt betrayed and left out. And at the same time, even that isn't the beginning, because you have to go back and realize that Byzantium has been attacked even before the West. So they're fighting the Muslims from expansion from 633 onwards or whatever, and they're not getting a lot of help from the West. So that they're the ones who have been on the forefront of fighting Islam. And they're the ones, Constantinople is besieged in 678, it's besieged in 1717. They are
717.
Fighting. Sorry, yeah. 678 and 717, I hope I get that right. And so, and at the same time, the West is also soon comes under attack. And, there are Muslims that take hold in Italy in the 8th century. And it actually ultimately is a joint effort by Constantinople and the West that drives them out of Italy, very interestingly. But then very rapidly, Italy becomes a battleground between Byzantium and the West. And of course, the Normans take that all the way to Thessaloniki. When they take Thessaloniki, that's after the Third Crusade. But at the same time, you have, was it Andronicus making a treaty with Saladin during the Third Crusade?
Isaac the Second Comnenus.
Was it
Isaac?
Right? Isaac Angelus was after Andronicus? Okay.
Angelus. I'm sorry, not Comnenus.
Yeah, it's Isaac Andronicus.
But I guess the point you're making is that kind of during that period when all that stuff was going on with Saladin, the Byzantine Empire had decided to kind of throw its luck in with Saladin, as opposed to the more traditional relationship with Western powers, I guess.
Well, I think we have to look at under Manuel I. You have a long period of close cooperation, very positive cooperation between Byzantium and the Holy Land. But even during that period, Manuel's fighting off Normans.
Right.
Right?
There was a lot of his reign was spent on wars in the West, probably more so than people might think. He spent a ton of time campaigning in Italy, I believe.
Yes, exactly. So essentially fighting the Normans in Italy, who, as I say, eventually pushed their way all the way up to Thessaloniki at one point and have to be thrown out again by forgetting his name, but the Byzantine general, who then is ultimately killed by Conrad de Montferrat. So, the West is not a solid block. You have Normans who may not have been or may or not have been supported by other people. You have William of Sicily backing Isaac Comnenus, the Cypriot despot, who is fighting is not accredited, shall we say, from Byzantium. A Sicilian fleet protects him from the revenge of Constantinople when he takes over Cyprus. It's as I say, it's very hard. There isn't a single storyline here, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Right.
You have Normans and you have the Holy Land maybe not operating, totally at odds with one another at times. You have periods, as I say, of cooperation when, and you have periods of conflict with Byzantium. So when you're looking at the Fourth Crusade, it isn't that they've always been friends and suddenly they turn on them and bite them. It isn't as though they have always been enemies And this was just the culmination of a long series of tensions. And it's very hard to, particularly if we're going to try to do this in an hour or something, to try to sort out, I think, all of that prehistory.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think, too, we can't necessarily just say that what was going on in the Fourth Crusade even had that much to do with the larger Crusade movement, or even with in some ways, it was a very kind of immediate conflict among the current Byzantine royal family.
Yes.
It's not, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is, it's not like, oh, well, the Fourth Crusade is obviously the sort of the long-term result of all this hostility between
There was,
Byzantium
I think
and the West.
There was nothing inevitable about the Fourth Crusade. It didn't have to happen. Other constellations could have it could have been prevented. It could have simply never been. But I think one of the things we pointed out before is that when you look specifically at the Venetian relation with Byzantium, it's really important to think that they had profited for years and decades and had been very privileged within Manuel I's Constantinople.
Mm-hmm.
And then in a move that really reminds me of Philip IV turning on the Templars, although he had been friends with them and they'd been having dinner with them sort of the day before, he turns on the Venetians, more or less to satisfy popular sentiment against the West. And from one night to the next, he arrests them all and he confiscates all their property, and he imprisons Venetians for the next 25 years. There are some men who aren't released until the Fourth Crusade. And Byzantium.
Are we talking about?
We're talking about 1171, when Manuel I attacks the Venetian communities in Constantinople.
Yeah.
Interestingly, he didn't attack them in all of his territories, but in Constantinople itself, they go out, as I say, in the dark of night, like Philip IV against the Templars, and he arrests the Venetian community, and he confiscates all their property. And he keeps many of those people in prison. And Venice actually tries to launch a fleet in revenge and is crushed. So you have the Venetian, and we'd have to go back. I don't know the exact history of the Doge, but he was a very old man by the time of the Fourth Crusade. And the probability that he had friends or relatives who had been impacted by that sudden arrest and confiscation in 1171 is very high. Mm-hmm. And the city as a whole is a very, very proud city. And all of a sudden, their citizens are arrested, their property is taken away from them, and there's nothing they can do about it. That's a festering wound. How long was 9/11? What if we hadn't been able to do anything since 9/11?
Right.
If we hadn't have been able to take action right away, I think that would still be a cause in the United States saying, revenge, revenge, revenge. And that's, I think, it was a similar kind of attack for the Venetians. As I say, the people were killed, their property was lost. And then initially, the rivals of Venice profit from this arrest, because Manuel I then turns over the concession, so to speak, to the Genoese and the Pisans, and they come in and they think this is great. We've got all this trade, we've got this monopoly on trade to the West. This is really, really lucrative. And then Andronicus comes in and turns the crowd, the mobs, loose on them. So there's this incredible massacre in 1182 of the other Italian cities.
Yeah. And I think in part what all this reflects too is this is I've spent some time studying Byzantine history, and I kind of think the impression I get is that this sort of there is sort of this instability that's centered around Constantinople. I mean, the amount of sort of revolutions and palace coups and emperors being murdered, one emperor murders another. That seems to be kind of a long-running theme throughout Byzantine history. And, part of that is different ethnic groups and nations that are embroiled in that. We talk about the Pisans, the Venetians, that extends to the Bulgarians, later different Muslim powers as well. There's kind of just this long history of that sort of tumultuous aspect to the way politics are conducted in Constantinople. And I think, Rodney Stark, in one of his books, pointed out how that there were Byzantine emperors themselves who sacked Constantinople when they like, in fact, Alexius I Comnenus, when he took control of Constantinople, he like many Byzantine emperors became emperor through a coup. and his army sacked Constantinople in 1081, but that just hasn't really made much of a lasting impression on history.
Well, as you say, we don't. It's a very, very complex history, which makes it very difficult for it to follow. And there are some great dissertations, I'm sure, waiting to be written here. To the extent that intrigue, as you're describing, and that infighting and the poisoning and the blinding and all of those kinds of things goes on in Constantinople, is still sort of like the legacy of Rome. It is the Eastern Roman Empire. It takes over a lot of the traditions of the infighting of ancient Rome, I think. Mm-hmm. You could at least, as I say, it might be a dissertation worth to look at that. And I agree with you 100% that this is a very different world. Constantinople is a very different environment from Paris or London.
Right. And I think that it's interesting.
Or even Rome, for that matter.
Yeah, and when we look at, for example, the Crusader states in the Levant, the Crusader states in the Levant existed under very perilous conditions frequently. However, it is interesting that the way that successions were handled, for the most part, was often fairly smooth. I mean, there was a sort of a legal process that they would go through. Even like during the Third Crusade, when things were all pretty competitive and there was this big controversy between Conrad and Guy, it was solved through a legal process, where it does seem like when you look at Byzantine history, you read through some of these big primary sources that go through a couple centuries, there's just this frequent occurrence of just the palace coup and sort of the riotous explosion in Constantinople itself. That's kind of how these things happen. And I know from reading Jonathan Phillips' book about the Fourth Crusade, he said that for a lot of the duration of the Fourth Crusade, a lot of the population of the city thought that was what was going on. There was sort of rival emperors engaged in infighting with each other.
And it was with their respective mercenaries. I mean, as far as you can literally say that the Fourth Crusade had been hijacked. By the time they attack Constantinople, they are acting as mercenaries for the Alexis IV. They are not acting in their capacity as crusaders.
Right. Yeah. Interesting.
So, you could almost say that the Fourth Crusade ends in Venice when they cannot pay for the ships. When they cannot pull together.
That's a good point.
From there on, it's not really a crusade. From then on, it is an army that is trying, as you know, Vahadrun makes clear, is trying to stick together or whatever in the hopes of then later having capacity. But it's basically no longer a crusade. It is a mercenary force which has been hired first by Venice and then essentially by Alexis IV to achieve objectives that are totally extraneous to the initial cause for which they came together.
Right, and I think something that could support that very easily is the fact that a crusade was a holy war called by the Pope with indulgences attached to it. Well, very early on, Pope Innocent III was condemning what this army was doing. So certainly the attack on Zara was considered to be a violation, and the attack on Constantinople as well. So, yeah, I think... Yeah, go ahead.
I would like to get back to what you're saying about the infighting, the coups. Another thing that was very, very different between the succession in the Holy Land and in Constantinople was that nobles basically took their oaths seriously. This sounds very arrogant, but
you're right.
Simply is that even in the Holy Land, even though Tripoli, basically says, no, this is a usurper and I'm not going to recognize him. But once he's reconciled with Guy, he goes onto the field of Hattin with his entire army. He follows the king, his liege lord. You don't have a single case of an assassination. You have a coup when Sibylla and Guy take the throne without the consent of the High Court. But you don't have murders, you don't have assassination, you don't have poison. This is not an environment like either the Sultan's courts where that's happening or Byzantium where that's happening. It's much, much more straightforward. A baron is more likely like Baldwin to Evelyn, who say, I can't serve you. It's hereby, in full public view, he throws down his I don't know what to say, he resigns as he turns over his territories to his son and leaves the country. He doesn't try to force a palace coup or murder somebody or poison Sibylla's tea,
Yeah.
So
I think that's the strength of the West, is that fairly early on, the legal institutions were just more stable. If you want to put it that way.
Again, I don't feel like I know enough to know why this was so, And there might be some really good, interesting theories if we had an expert on Byzantium. I can only observe that there were very, very different, modus operandi going on here. I would like to point out that in terms of getting just to the Fourth Crusade itself, because obviously the people acting at that time weren't always historians. They weren't necessarily thinking about this long history. I think that there were serious issues with the legitimacy of Alexis III.
Yeah, I would have to look at the politics more closely, but it's.
But you had the Manuel the First, who's really the good friend of the Holy Land and people. He's reigns for over 40 years. There's a lot of stability there, and then his only son comes to the throne, and he's a young boy. I think he's 11 or 12, and his regent is his Western, Maria of Antioch is his mother, and she is then murdered. Alexis, the second, is murdered. So Manuel's son is ultimately murdered, and Manuel's only daughter, also Maria, I believe, and her husband, and this important Rainer de Montferrat, are murdered when Andronicus comes in. So you have sort of the Manuel's legitimate line is, although Isaac calls himself Angelus, because although he's a distant relative and actually has some connection to the Comneni, he's not really considered a Comnenus.
Right.
And he comes in, and of course you have Andronicus in the meantime, who commits the massacre of the Latins in 1182, and incredibly brutal, very, very violent, and it's ultimately torn apart by the mob. And you were talking about some of the things that are different. It's not just that you have these palace coups, you also have the role of the mob in Constantinople, and people use that mob against their rivals, effectively or not. And this is the case where Andronicus first uses the mob to bring down Alexis II, but he then the mob turns on him and tears him apart. I mean, it's really, really brutal descriptions, gruesome descriptions of what they do to Andronicus. And Isaac comes up sort of almost by surprise. He's the emperor. He's not all that legitimate, but from the Western point of view, he was seen as sort of, a little bit more stable than Andronicus. But then he gets blinded, and his brother comes over, and it's like, I think that there was probably a widespread perception in the West that, these guys this isn't Manuel. We're not dealing with a stable emperor here who has control of his bureaucracy and his people. We're dealing with a bunch of, not terribly high-ranking people who are murdering their way to power and using the mob. And I think that also undermined, any respect for the Byzantine empire in 1204.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, the Angeloi dynasty, its history is pretty universally acknowledged as one of the absolute low points in Byzantine history. Yeah. I mean, we go from this period when Manuel Comnenus really is ruling over a very prosperous and powerful empire to a period of pretty much total decay. I mean, I know that what we have going on with the Angeloi is we have a lot of civil conflict. We have the various Angeloi brothers hiring Turkish mercenaries to sack various Byzantine towns. I mean, this seems like sort of an atrocity against Christendom in a way. But as far as I know, every Byzantine history I've read, the Angeloi were horrible emperors. The empire was in a total state of decay. The army was in a state of decay. There was no longer law and order, and they pretty much just did as the best they could to enjoy, the good life and fine eating while everything fell apart around them for the course of 2 decades leading up to the Fourth Crusade.
Well, increasing taxes and there's no evidence of good governance in any corner.
Right. Yeah.
And therefore, as I say, if you're not, first of all, it probably would have been impossible to attack Manuel I.
Exactly.
But there was also there was less inclination on the part of the West to attack someone who was viewed as legitimate.
Right. I mean, if Byzantium had a capable emperor at that time, something like the siege and conquest of Constantinople in 1204 would have been impossible. Yeah.
Exactly.
And those couple of decades leading up to that played a huge role in making that conquest possible anyway. So,
Right. And we're back to the fact these are the same guys who are sometimes making truces with Saladin, etc., and of course trying to stop the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa from his, really hindering his Third Crusade.
Yeah, that's one thing. Well, that's one thing we actually mentioned when we were recording on Saturday, is that that's what happens. This Emperor Isaac II, Angelus, he basically goes to war with Frederick Barbarossa, and as far as I can tell, I just read a bunch of primary sources related to Frederick's crusade. He really made an effort to maintain a peaceable relationship with Byzantium and simply to cross the empire. There's no indication that Frederick was trying to conquer the Byzantine Empire. And it's very strange. Isaac essentially throws all of his weight in with Saladin, which that doesn't really gain him anything. All it gains him is making an enemy of Frederick, and essentially his empire suffers for it. But Frederick Barbarossa essentially conquers the Byzantine Empire to cross through it. And the only reason he doesn't, for example, occupy Constantinople or something like that is just because he really does just want to get through so he can get to Palestine.
Yeah, that's what everything I read would support that view as well. So but this is not that long ago. We're getting back to this is all within living memory of the people who take part. Yeah, take part in the of the Fourth Crusade. 14 years isn't that long.
Right.
It's less than with the time back to 9/11.
Yeah. So interesting stuff. So we've really touched on a lot of good background and sort of introduction to the Fourth Crusade here, Dr. Schrader. I'm just going to kind of look at some of the questions I had prepared for you. And I think we've really already addressed this issue of Manuel and his policy toward the Latins, how the death of Manuel Comnenus had an impact on Byzantine and Latin relations. We've definitely looked at that. So
another thing, something I question, of course, is we have Richard take Cyprus away from a renegade despot in 1191 as he on his way to the Holy Land, and it remains then in Latin hands. And we don't really know a lot about the early history of Cyprus, but by the time Almeric is king of Cyprus, and it seems to be stable, and it seems to not be any sort of revolt. There's an early revolt against the Templars, and there may have been considerable unrest under Guy, but by 1194, Aimery starts to really stabilize the situation in Cyprus and has turned that into a stable Latin monarchy, which, of course, is a very strong base of operations into the Holy Land. But it's also, you wonder, what's the impact of that on Constantinople?
As far as I can tell from what I've read about it, for the Byzantine emperors at that time, I mean, they were in no position to really do much about it, and they didn't show much interest in it. So
they seem to have abandoned it altogether.
I mean, and that was kind of the situation in general. Cyprus wasn't the only sort of peripheral Byzantine holding to fall off the map during this era. That was kind of the general trend. So I think it just points to one more aspect of how the Angeloi degraded the Byzantine state. So interesting.
Yeah.
So did you have anything else you wanted to add on any of that, or
No. Okay.
I was going to ask you a little bit. I know that I had pointed out this issue of Pope Innocent III coming to the papacy and how that influenced the Crusades movement. Obviously, Innocent III is kind of interesting because this is a pope who really views crusading as the central aspect of his papacy. And I think that trend had been that's kind of the way the Latin world had been moving ever since Pope Urban II. By the time we get to the turn of the 13th century in 1200, crusading really is an institution in the Latin West. So I was just going to ask you, Dr. Schrader, how do you think Pope Innocent viewed his role in organizing the Crusades? What do you think that meant to him?
I think I said before, I really don't feel that qualified, but he seems to have, claimed the premise that he have claimed to say, this isn't something that kings organize or, nobles do. This is a papal responsibility. And I think he claimed the right to determine what is a crusade, including the fact that the crusades against the Albigensians and things that doesn't fall within our understanding of crusading so much in the modern world. But that's the way he defined it. He defined it as anything. If this Hitler's expression or Goering's expression, I decide who's a Jew. I think he saw it as I decide what's a crusade.
Yeah, and there was some precedent for that. I mean, obviously, the papacy had instigated the Crusades movement, and there was this, and the idea was that the Pope calling for this, that's what even made a war a crusade. Various campaigns received papal bulls to go on crusading, to actually conduct a crusade, to actually get the indulgence that was attached to it. So yeah, it's just go
certainly
ahead.
not at the beginning. No, certainly not at the beginning, because Urban, he's basically saying we need to do something, and here are you idle men fighting each other, and I know the Franks are the best fighters in the world, and you should be spending your energy on something worthwhile, and I'll show you how much I want you to do this, and then I'm going to give you some incentives. But it wasn't institutionalized, as you say.
Right, at that point it was not.
An appeal. It was an appeal, and
Absolutely,
I even think by the Second Crusade seems to be far more, Louis the Seventh's penance, and there's all sorts of things going on there that have less to do with the Pope deciding that he's going to call this for a crusade. And even the Third Crusade is much more a reaction to the horror at the loss of Jerusalem, because people had been very complacent about it and kept assuming that all these appeals from the Holy Land, it's another one, it's sort of calling wolf too often. They're always asking us for money and men, and they'll figure it out. They'll sort it out. The leper takes care of things. He keeps winning wars out there anyways. I wouldn't have to do anything. And then they lose Jerusalem, and there's just this, everybody's galvanated. They didn't have to wait for somebody to go out and preach it to them. They're out there vowing to take the Jerusalem back on their own practically. So it is almost, after that it becomes a papal call.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that we can say that the Third Crusade involved a papal bull, involved the issuing of indulgences. So that element was there. But I think but
it isn't what sparked the crusade, is what I'm saying. Do you think?
I think
the spark was just the loss of Jerusalem. Yeah,
I mean, I agree with you. The Crusades were both a popular movement and something that resulted from certain developments in the church. That's all there. And I definitely agree that increasingly over time it was becoming more institutionalized, and we really see that get going, especially with Innocent III. And also the thing with Innocent III that's so crucial is he took on this idea that the church really needs to have control over the crusade. It's not just the Pope is going to preach for this and offer an indulgence, and then the secular lords will take over. Innocent really seems to have taken an active role in trying to organize crusading, figure out where they're going to go, how it's going to be done, that kind of thing. So I think that's what we're seeing with Pope Innocent III, and I think it's just more proof of how the Crusades movement had become so central to Latin civilization. How this was no longer just an appeal the Pope was making, but this was sort of the central aspect of his administration. I mean, Pope Innocent was calling crusades all through his
exactly, and it's as far as I'm concerned, it's inconceivable that there would have been an Albigensian crusade without the Pope.
Oh, absolutely.
The nobles whereas I think that there was a genuine popular desire to retake Jerusalem after its loss. I don't think there was a great widespread popular desire to go down and wipe out the Albigensian heresy.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very fair to say.
So, despite saying that, the other thing that's really, really interesting when you look at the Fourth Crusade is who starts it. And the first two crusaders that are mentioned are both nephews of Richard the Lionheart.
Yeah.
And the leader that they finally get, Montferrat, is the brother of Sibylla's first husband, the brother of Isabella's second husband, and the brother of the murdered Reiner, who had been married to Isaac Angelus's sister.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this is not necessarily widespread popular stuff. This is a very small clique of interrelated nobles from the Champagne and Flanders and the Ile-de-France.
Yeah, that actually came up when we were talking on Saturday. Rand was pointing out how the leadership of the Fourth Crusade it's kind of unlike a lot of other crusades. It was this inner circle of, relatives and brothers-in-law, these upper nobility from France, these guys like Louis of Blois, the Count of Champagne. Yeah, that is a really interesting aspect to the Fourth Crusade.
The Count of Champagne is the brother of the Henri de Champagne, who's has been king of Jerusalem. He just backed out of a window, so he's no longer king. But this is his younger brother. This is Henri de Champagne's younger brother.
Yeah.
And Richard the Lionheart's nephew, who's starting this crusade.
Right. It's not like the Third Crusade or the First Crusade where we have crusaders coming.
Barbarossa.
Right. We have crusaders coming from everywhere. Like the First Crusade had leadership from every corner of Europe almost, from the south of France to Italy to, the Holy Roman Empire. I mean, it just...
Normans, yeah.
Yeah, from everywhere. Whereas this really is very much from this kind of particular region of France, from this particular circle. So, and that has an influence on shaping the direction of the crusade too. So, yeah, that's a really good point.
It weakens their financial position. You don't have Friedrich Barbarossa's and Richard the Lionheart's and Philip II's, chests of gold.
Right,
and
right.
Richard, all three of them, the emperor and Philip and Richard, took a year, raising new taxes and really preparing to finance this thing. And Richard was a very, very astute financier, and he made sure his war chest was full before he went on crusade. And here are a bunch of young noblemen. I believe Thibault was only 22 when he took the crusade, saying, "Okay, well, let's go on crusade together," and they have no idea what it really costs. You have this feeling that, there are a bunch of young nobles, out on the tourney circuit. Doesn't it say they started at one of the tournaments when they start making these vows?
All the cross-taking happens at a tournament, yeah.
And it's like a lot of youthful enthusiasm. And because they're their lord, they drag their vassals with them, so that even some of the more seasoned men who should have known better, but their lord's taken the cross and they're going to support him because that's what feudalism was about. Mm-hmm. And when they get dragged all the way to Zara and on to Constantinople, it's still because they're sticking together as relatives and as vassals to that central core. Mm-hmm. This isn't, as I say, a well-organized campaign of the sort that Richard the Lionheart or Philip II or Frederick Barbarossa put together. Or even what Louis VII, bad as he was, he still took his time, and he had the resources of an entire kingdom.
Yeah, that's all very good points. So yeah, I think we've kind of really touched on sort of this beginning stage of the Fourth Crusade. Did you have
the last one you'd asked me a little bit about the contract with Venice?
Yes, yeah. Did you have some comments about that?
That the bottom line is the people who were sent had no idea what the resources they were committing. I honestly don't think anybody was sitting there as an accountant and saying, well, look at, so-and-so has so many sheep and so-and-so has so many cows and there's so much, this is turning up that much revenue in that land. Okay, this is what we could come together. They were presented with a bill from Venice, which I think was probably legitimate. I think the Venetians, they were making a profit, but they weren't necessarily gouging them, okay? The Venetians were merchants. They could sit down and say, okay, you have this many men, this many horses, you're going to have this many ships. That's going to cost us this much in wood. It's going to cost us this much in tar and blah, blah, blah. They could come up with a fairly reasonable, a bill, because they did that all the time. That was their job. And I think these 6 negotiators in Venice didn't have a clue about finances in that sense. Not saying they didn't manage their own estates perfectly reasonably. I have no idea. I'm not imputing, but I don't think that they had any idea about what the actual resources were of all those people they were representing.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, we definitely know that the estimation of the amount of men they were going to have was off. And that's a big theme in Geoffrey de Villehardouin's Chronicle, is that, these guys who didn't come, they went by other ports, because there were a lot of people who just, took off on their own to go to Acre. So, that obviously was an issue.
But he's legitimate in saying, if we all said we were going to go together and then they don't come together, I can be angry at them. But even if they'd all come together, do you have any idea what their actual financial, what their liquidity was, what they actually could afford? I don't think he did. I don't think how he could possibly know what all of those people actually could afford. And therefore, the whole basis was, it's not phony, because it was not that anybody intentionally tried to deceive anybody else. I just think it was, built on sand from the very start, because he didn't have the oversight of people's financial resources to be able to make a rational decision about whether they could afford what they had committed themselves to.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Okay. Yeah, the Fourth Crusade, it's kind of a frustrating campaign. There's not a lot about it that's romantic and inspiring.
No.
In fact, maybe not at all. But it's very fascinating, though.
Well, they did succeed in taking a city that otherwise was almost invincible,
right?
which is actually quite a fascinating little piece of a military history. I mean, as I say, the Muslims failed twice, and then even in 52? When does it finally fall to the Ottomans?
1453. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I mean, that is an interesting thing about it. We've got this long history of Constantinople. It's almost never taken, and then one of the few times it's taken is from this crazy Fourth Crusade. So, and it's fascinating how that happened. And when you actually look at the details of it, some of these really good books that have been done about it by scholars like Thomas Madden and Jonathan Phillips. I mean, it's a really crazy, fascinating story how they actually managed to do it. So yeah, go ahead.
Worth a podcast. I just said, so that's worth a podcast. Yes,
that's where it's heading. Yeah, that'll be interesting. I'm looking forward to that. So, yeah, thanks a lot, Dr. Schrader. It was great having you with me as usual. Thank you. I did want to ask you though, how are things going with your books? I know you just released your third book in the Balian series, so let's definitely kind of plug that.
Oh, thank you very much. Envoy of Jerusalem, which covers the period post the fall of Jerusalem through the end of the Third Crusade, was released in August. It's gotten some very good reviews so far. I've been pleased with that. And Defender of Jerusalem, the second book in the series, which ends with the Hattin and then the fall of Jerusalem, was just awarded the silver in the Reader's Favorites Book Awards for Christian historical fiction. So I'm very proud of that, too.
Yeah, awesome. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
And Dr. Schrader, your website is Defending Crusader Kingdoms. That is your blog.
That's a blog. That's right. At blogspot.com. And the website is just defenderofjerusalem.com. And that's got a lot of the articles that are in the blog, but organized more by topic. So if you're interested in going in and looking at, Crusader castles, you can find it right away. It was once a blog, but it's harder to, scroll back chronologically. So the website's more useful if you know what you're looking for.
Yeah.
The blog's probably more fun if you just don't know what you care, just interested in, occasional, weekly essay on the topic.
Yeah, definitely. And I know that, at Real Crusades History, we are constantly posting your various articles and whatnot, so it's good stuff. So we want to encourage everybody to be checking out Dr. Schrader's websites. They'll be in the description box for this podcast. So yeah, I just want to thank everybody for listening. It was great talking with Dr. Schrader today. I'm J. Stephen Roberts, and we are Real Crusades History. You can find us at realcrusadeshistory.com. Thank you. My new book, Why Does the Heathen Rage?, a novel of the Crusades set during the reign of King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, is now available in paperback and Kindle on Amazon. Please click on the link in the About box of this video to get your copy. Also, if you would like to support Real Crusades History by offering a donation, you will find a PayPal donate link in the About box of this video. Thank you.